It was sort of a somber week here in the world. I mean, it's always a somber week in 2020, but it was an especially somber week in the world of professional wrestling.
Yes, it was absolutely.
Yeah. I've purchased you a little something to sort of help ease your pain a little bit. You have it in your possession. I assume you've not looked at it yet. It's what I asked you to retrieve from your car. I did the normal.
Oh, you bought
I did the normal
me,
drop off thing where this morning I put it in the back seat of your car and drove away.
My back seat was filthy.
I just stuck it in there.
Sorry about that. So should I open this now? Oh boy, what do we got here? Oh, no. An old copy of The Wrestler. I'll show this. Let me get the... Where'd you find this at, Bode? This is hillbilly flea market levels of rarity. That is a old copy of The Wrestler. I used to have so many of these, Bode. And right on the cover here is two of my favorites mentioned. There's Tommy Wildfire Rich. He was my second favorite guy. And then right underneath him, Mr. Wrestling number 2 was mentioned. I gotta open this up and have a look. Wow, this is pretty old. 81.
Pretty old. It's as old as I am.
Well, I'm older. There's Larry Zbyszko on the cover, and he's got a reverse chin lock on Pedro Morales. This was a sad week. Thank you, Bode, because I will look through this thing like you wouldn't believe. These things always take me back.
Now, a lot of people, even wrestling fans, people that are really hardcore into wrestling of today, may not know about Mr. Wrestling 2 and what made him special, what made him your favorite. Do you want to eulogize him for us?
Well, there he is in the white mask. That's Mr. Wrestling number 2. And here's a color picture of him right here on the back. You can see he's featured amongst the superstars you can get posters of, along with Steamboat. You got Mil Mascaras and Dusty Rhodes, Nick Bockwinkel, Bob Backlund, all the big stars. Wrestling 2, it's funny because when I was thinking about this, I was talking to my dad yesterday. I was going to the babysitter when I was 3, 4, or 5 years old, which means this puts me in about 75, 76, 77, that era. And my babysitters were an old couple named Jackie and Bob Edwards, great people. And we knew them long after, that I was old enough to be babysat. And they used to watch Georgia Championship Wrestling. And I would sit there and watch it because most of what they watched I didn't care about. But that's where I got into wrestling. And one of the first guys I saw in there was a guy named Mr. Wrestling 2, the masked Mr. Wrestling 2. His story is long and complicated. His real name was Johnny Walker. He started wrestling in the 50s as Johnny Rubberman Walker. And he was sort of a journeyman wrestler. He was a good wrestler. He actually did wrestling and sumo when he trained. He learned wrestling at the YMCA and began to be a pro wrestler and wrestled for literally 10, 12 years as the Johnny, or maybe longer, as Rubberman, and then eventually he donned a mask and became one of the many grapplers. He was a grappler in Florida, and then he was basically set to retire. He had bought a gas station, and he was going to retire when there was a split between the owners in the Georgia region, and a lady named Ann Gunkel, whose husband had controlled the NWA, had split apart from and taken most of the wrestlers with her from the Georgia promotion. And they scrambled to get people together because they did this right before the biggest card of the year, right? So this is a real double cross. And so they scrambled to get a lot of wrestlers there to work. And so there was a guy named Tim Woods who went by the name Mr. Wrestling. And Mr. Wrestling was a guy who was used heavily in Florida, but they needed him in Georgia desperately. And so they worked out a deal where he would come to Florida occasionally, or to Georgia occasionally, but he would still headline in Florida most of the time. And so they needed someone to fill in the gaps for when he wasn't available. And so they called up Johnny Rubberman Walker and put him under a hood, and he became Mr. Wrestling 2. And they were tag partners, Mr. Wrestling 1 and Mr. Wrestling 2. That's so, because a lot of people are confused. Why do you like a guy who's Mr. Wrestling 2? That's why he was 2. And he kept that name through his whole career because, amazingly, he actually went way past Mr. Wrestling 1. If you'll recall, Ric Flair was injured in a plane wreck. You remember hearing this tale? He had his back broken. Well, amongst the people in that plane wreck were Mr. Wrestling 1, Tim Woods. And his career was over. Well, he was done. He couldn't come back. And so Mr. Wrestling 2, and they had 1 and 2 had teamed and feuded back and forth, but Mr. Wrestling 2 sort of picked up. He became the #1 guy in the Georgia territory, and he was super duper popular. You wouldn't think a guy that came out in white trunks and a white mask, that generic looking mask, but he was super popular. He had this believability, and he was a good worker. But by this point, he was in his late 40s.
Oh, wow.
So he was his best days were way behind him. Even when I saw him, you got to think he started in 56. I saw him in 76.
Yeah.
So he was well in there, 20-year veteran. And he went for a long time in Georgia as the #1 guy, and I remember his feud. The one that got me when I was a kid, he feuded with the masked superstar, who he did the Cobra Clutch, and he bet $10,000 that no one could escape it. And Mr. Wrestling 2 escaped it, and that sucker wouldn't pay him the money. I remember being so mad as a kid that this dirty scumbag, Mr. Superstar, wouldn't give Mr. Wrestling 2 his money. They were a great feud. Mr. Wrestling 2 feuded with Harley Race and Ric Flair. Everybody.
Was that the beginning? Is that what Money in the Bank is?
No, it's got zero to do with that. Where did you get that?
It's a word I heard. It's wrestling.
No, that was 20s. You're nuts. Anyways, so Wrestling 2, Georgia sort of wound down. He was big. By the way, his finishing move does have something to do with money. His finishing maneuver was the $1 million knee lift. He would run across the ring, give you a big knee lift, and and he would also smack the opponent on the back. It made this noise, and that was his finish. It was a great
Wait a minute.
move.
Explain the knee lift one more time.
So here's a guy bent over across the ring. He runs over and then knees the guy in the face. And as he does it, he'll kind of smack the guy, so it makes this noise. It looks like he's kneeing this guy's brains out.
So it's not like a lift, like a press lift. Okay.
No,
okay.
No, so it's a real simple move, but he did it great. And when he did it, people would go two. It's sort of like Jake's DDT. It was very similar, Then he went everywhere, but eventually he went to a place that Bill Watts ran a territory down in Oklahoma, where he teamed up with a very young Magnum TA, and this great storyline where he was sort of nurtured. It was the young guy getting nurtured by the old guy, and they had a great feud with like the Midnight Express and some of these, but eventually two turned on him, and this helped get Magnum TA over.
I still remember his theme song. Backstreet Magnum TA.
No, that's wrong. You're thinking Michael P.S. Hayes and the Freebirds. TA didn't need a theme song. He was just a bad dude. Yeah. And then eventually, when the WWF took over the time slot for Georgia on TBS, Wrestling 2 ended up going to WWF, but by this point he was at 50. And so they just used him sort of as a job enhancement guy. Then he sort of went around the promotions for a while, in independent approach, just living off his name for a while. And then eventually he retired. And he was originally from Hawaii. So he went back to Hawaii, and he's been there. And he passed away, I think it was Wednesday, at the age of 85. So which is a pretty good run. Let me ask you a
question. What is the percentage of wrestlers that you believe that are still working the independent circuit because they love wrestling versus the number of wrestlers that are still working the independent circuit because they're dead broke and they need the money?
I'd say most of the people working the indies is because they want the money. Now, there are a few that are lingering around. You got to think, if you're a guy like, let's say you're Jimmy Valiant, the Boogeyman, all right, and who's as old as the hills. He goes out there because his name was such that he can still go out and do nothing and get paid by promoters because people will come to see him because he's so old. He's a super legend.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Those guys do it just so it's a cheap buck, and plus they probably get off on it because
it's like all the people wanted the cons and stuff like that.
It's sort of like an old rock and roll guy, like I just went and saw the Midnight Express last year. Now they're not going to wrestle; they're mauled, but they were my childhood heroes. I wanted to meet them, get a picture with them, and I did. And they got paid, and I'm willing to pay because I want to meet them. That's just part of it. But in terms of guys that do it because They need the money. I mean, they're not going to make a ton of money unless if you're like The Rock or something, But most guys aren't going to go out there and make tons of money on the indie scene because there's not a lot of money to be made, But I mean, the indie scene's more powerful now than it's been for a long time. Well, not now because of the virus, but it was pretty. You can make a decent living if you're good, but most of your legends aren't going to go out there and get paid a ton because they're strictly there to fill some seats and get a few bucks. Sometimes they'll sell a lot of merch and make some money that way. Wrestling too, though, he very rarely went to conventions. He went to one in Carolina and North Carolina one time, and me and Hose wanted to go to it, we just couldn't go. And I think that's the last time he ever did one because he was so old. But he's probably my only favorite that I never got to meet.
Speaking of Hose, what a missed opportunity for Ted DiBiase to not adopt that move.
Well, he does do it. He does do the knee lift. Oh, yeah. A lot of the old timers do it. It was a popular move back in the day. You don't see it that much now. I mean, people do it, but no one thinks much about it. Wrestling 2 did it. Like, you see people do the DDT, but it's not like when Jake did it, because when Jake did it, that was in the match.
Right.
And there was a lot of pomp and circumstance. But, yeah, thank you very much, both for the magazine. I'll definitely look through this. I used to have so many of these. It makes me sad that I lost them all. But this is, you picked the right week to grade. Did you get this before Wrestling 2 died, or after?
Well, it's funny. I'd had it for a while, and I was waiting for a good opportunity to give it to you. And so because I knew you loved Mr. Wrestling 2, that's the reason why I bought it. I was actually looking at, it's really hard to find anything Mr. Wrestling 2 related. He's not like a lot of these guys where you just type in his name on eBay and you get 15,000 different things. I mean, he like you said, since he didn't do a lot of the independent shows and stuff, there's not a whole lot of signed stuff or anything like that out there.
I will say this. I never got to meet him, but the guy, remember I told you he feuded with the Masked Superstar who did the Cobra Clutch? I hated that guy. We met him, believe it or not. And Hose, I'll never forget this, was at a horrible show in Huntington. And Hose walked, the guy that was the Masked Superstar, have you ever heard of a tag team called Demolition?
No.
They're in the WrestleFest game.
Wait a minute, is it the guys that look like the Road Warriors? Okay, yeah,
right.
yeah.
Believe it or not, he's not, there were 3 Demolition. The original 2 were Axe and Smash. He was Axe, but the guys in WrestleFest are Smash and Crush. Crush sucked. But anyway, we went to a show, and sure enough, here comes Demolition Axe. He's on the show. Hose had a Masked Superstar mask. I don't know where Hose got this, like Mexico or Japan or something. And he took it, and the Masked Superstar signed it, and he signed it. He put Super and then made a star, because that's how he signed stuff. And he held it up, and he looked at it, and he smiled, and he goes, "Now, where did you get this?" He was so moved by this, because he was a whole other character, and it had been, no one knew who he was, It was awesome. And I thought to myself, this is the guy that tried to kill my favorite, So it just, this is, to people that don't like wrestling, this means this is just blowing in the wind. But if you're just like anything else, if you're nostalgic, you get for soccer or hockey or anything, it's sort of the same thing, except wrestling is so much more goofy.
Ultimate late face turn for Masked Superstar for you.
Well, all those old guys could work, they could talk. And one thing, you see this a lot now, and especially in Mexico, but Mr. Wrestling 2 and Superstar both did something I always thought was awesome. It's a great look. There were masked guys that would come out in full suits.
Oh, yeah.
And look like $1 million bucks. So you knew these guys were making tons of money, because look at how they were dressed.
Look at that guy.
That's
bam.
Like I said, you see it a lot in Mexico, but in America you don't see it so much. But I always thought that was a cool look to have the full suit and the mask, because you were a proper gentleman. You're gonna go crush a guy, but you're gonna do it because you're out there to get paid. I like that.